When Princess Beatrice walked into her foundation's London office, expecting to finalize a new child outreach initiative, she instead found her staff in tears and her accounts frozen. The silence was deafening, no prior notice, no explanation, and worst of all, the royal family's crest had been removed from the official paperwork. What happened? And why would her own uncle orchestrate this royal betrayal? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded in that moment was not just administrative chaos. It felt like an execution without a trial. Phones lay abandoned on desks, unread emails glowing like unanswered cries, and faces that had once been filled with purpose now collapsed under shock. Beatrice stood frozen, scanning the room, sensing instantly that this was not a delay or a technical failure. Her foundation, the one she had built quietly, passionately, away from palace theatrics, had been gutted overnight. Staff members tried to explain through sobs, payment systems locked, partner organizations suddenly unreachable, scheduled donations reversed without warning. One by one, every lifeline had been severed. Some employees spoke of calls in the early hours of the morning, voices refusing to identify themselves, instructing banks and legal teams to stand down immediately. No paperwork, no signatures shown, only authority implied, only power assumed, and somehow everyone had obeyed. Beatrice's first instinct was not anger, it was disbelief. She asked if there had been a mistake, if an audit had failed, if someone had misunderstood a filing. But when a senior coordinator quietly revealed that the royal crest had been formally withdrawn from all documents, the air changed. That crest was not symbolic. It was protection. It was access. It was survival. Without it, the foundation wasn't merely paused. It was exposed. Vulnerable. Already being erased. Suspicion didn't creep in. It slammed into her, because nothing like this could happen without the palace knowing, without the palace ordering it. Her hands trembled as she stepped away, phone already in her grip, scrolling to a number she had never imagined calling in fear. Edward. The uncle who had always presented himself as measured, distant, neutral, the one who oversaw financial structures, the one whose signature carried weight in rooms she was never invited into. She pressed call. Once. No answer. Twice. Straight to voicemail. The silence felt louder than any accusation. And in that silence, something darker took shape. Not a budget issue, not a compliance review. This was intentional, coordinated, designed to suffocate quietly before anyone could react. When Beatrice reached out to Palace Communications, she was met with polite confusion. When she contacted royal aides she had known for years, messages went unread. Doors didn't slam. They simply vanished. By the afternoon, word had already begun to leak, but only in fragments. Rumors of internal restructuring. Whispers of temporary reassessment. No official clarification. No defense. No support. The media, usually relentless, suddenly restrained. Articles drafted, then pulled. Commentators going silent mid-sentence. Someone was managing the narrative, and someone was making sure her voice never entered it. Standing there, in the ruins of something she had poured her name, her heart, and her future into, Beatrice finally felt what generations of royals before her had learned too late. Inside the palace, love is conditional, support is political, and survival depends entirely on who is willing to protect you when the machinery turns. But what Beatrice didn't know was that this wasn't a clerical error, it was a calculated strike from within the family, with Prince Edward pulling the strings. While the world celebrated Prince Edward's quiet dignity, behind palace walls he had signed a document that would send shockwaves through the House of Windsor. His pen halted Beatrice's funding not just for a project, but for her entire legacy. Long before Beatrice ever discovered the foundation's abrupt shutdown, Edward had already made his move. Hidden among routine financial reviews and quarterly policy memos was a directive, coded, concise, and devastating. It authorized an immediate freeze on all financial disbursements connected to the Beatrice initiative, citing operational realignment in accordance with future monarchy directives. There were no consultations, no hearings, just a silent flick of the wrist that turned her vision into a liability. The document, buried under layers of bureaucratic language, was so deliberately constructed that even those closest to Beatrice wouldn't have noticed until it was far too late. But Edward wasn't alone in orchestrating this maneuver. He had help, and the fingerprints were faint but present. Within the Royal Finance Board, a tightly controlled circle of advisors quietly coordinated the effort. There was no paper trail linking them directly to Edward, but those familiar with the palace's inner workings knew exactly how power flowed. Trusted aides began reassessing redundant expenditures weeks before the freeze. Behind closed doors, meetings were held late at night, always off calendar, always without minutes. When one board member was overheard saying, "It's time to clean house," no one dared to ask who he meant. But the answer was becoming clearer by the hour. What emerged from these secret conversations was a calculated timeline, weeks of planning cloaked in silence. While Beatrice travelled internationally for engagements and fundraising drives, her fate was being decided in drawing rooms she had never been invited into. The plan had been carefully timed to coincide with Beatrice's upcoming global summit, an event that, had it proceeded, would have cemented her as a rising force within royal philanthropy. Cutting her funding days before the summit wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Sources now point to a private meeting between Prince Edward and King Charles as the potential turning point. While the content of their discussion remains classified, whispers inside Clarence House suggest it ended with a warning from Charles. "We cannot afford another loose narrative." Whether Edward interpreted that as instruction or permission is unclear. But what followed can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. From that point forward, Edward became noticeably more involved in decisions surrounding non-senior royals, especially those viewed as operating independently. And where was Sophie Wessex during this? Close by, observing, present in several of those hushed meetings. Some say she questioned Edward's motives behind closed doors. Others suggest she stood by silently, fearing what challenging him might provoke. To this day, she has refused to comment on the matter publicly. Her silence has only added weight to the belief that this wasn't an impulsive decision, but a deliberate reshaping of royal influence. As Edward's dissatisfaction grew with what he reportedly described as unstructured, unsanctioned royal activity, the writing on the wall for Beatrice became impossible to ignore. She had become too visible, too independent, and worst of all, too uncontrollable. Edward saw it not as progress, but as rebellion. And just as Beatrice began investigating the funding cut, she was met with resistance, escalating into a chilling pattern of royal sabotage. Her charity work was bold, independent, and unapologetically modern, everything the older generation feared. Princess Beatrice wasn't just fundraising. She was building a voice, and that voice was starting to echo louder than anyone had anticipated. Had her growing influence made her a target? From the beginning, Beatrice approached royal duty differently. While others clung to tradition, she dared to evolve it. Her foundation didn't just serve royal appearances, it delivered impact. Focused on youth leadership, mental health advocacy, and social equity, it attracted praise not just from the UK, but from global changemakers. Her name began to circulate not merely in royal columns, but in philanthropic circles typically reserved for world leaders and influencers. And with each success, Beatrice quietly began to redefine what it meant to be a modern royal. But behind the scenes, that success sparked something dangerous: resentment. For years, her presence had been understated, often overshadowed by more senior royals. But now, with her own initiatives thriving, invitations arriving from international stages, and her message resonating with younger generations, the narrative shifted. She wasn't waiting to be relevant, she had made herself essential. And that evolution unsettled those still gripping to the monarchy's rigid past. In palace corridors, whispers turned into concerns. Traditionalists labelled her work as unfiltered and off-brand, subtly suggesting that she was straying too far from the carefully curated royal script. Prince Edward, in particular, seemed increasingly disturbed by the rising spotlight on Beatrice. Some insiders claim his disapproval was rooted in protocol, that Beatrice, as a non-senior royal, was stepping out of line. Others suggest something more personal, a quiet jealousy simmering beneath the surface. His vision of the monarchy was one of structure and hierarchy, not passion and reform. And Beatrice, whether intentionally or not, was challenging all of it. What made matters worse for Edward was her growing alliance with Catherine, Princess of Wales. Their private conversations, casual on the outside, held the seeds of something far more powerful. Together, they discussed the future of the monarchy not as a relic, but as a living, evolving institution. They shared frustrations, exchanged visions, and even debated the unspoken question that loomed in every royal decision: who gets to lead the change? Beatrice's expanding reach was no longer just a matter of personal success. It was beginning to look like influence. And in the royal firm, influence without permission is dangerous. Some insiders feared that Beatrice was on the verge of becoming the activist royal, a label that thrilled younger citizens and horrified conservative strategists. Her independence, her refusal to wait for royal sanction, and her commitment to action over optics made her magnetic to the public and threatening to the institution. This wasn't about titles, it was about narrative control. Beatrice was telling her own story, and the firm could feel it slipping away. Edward, deeply embedded in the old order, viewed this as a crack in the dam, one that had to be sealed before others followed. And so, the pressure began. The quiet warnings, the frozen funding, the subtle sidelining. It wasn't just an attack on Beatrice's foundation. It was an attack on what her rise represented. But just as her reputation soared, the cracks beneath the royal surface began to fracture, with her father, Prince Andrew, at the centre of the collateral damage. They say the sins of the father shouldn't fall on the child, but in Beatrice's case, the crown didn't seem to agree. As the scandal surrounding Prince Andrew cast a permanent shadow over royal proceedings, some insiders say Edward made a silent pact: protect the monarchy by isolating its liabilities. Starting with Beatrice. From the moment Prince Andrew's name became synonymous with scandal, the royal machinery began recalibrating its every move. Appearances, associations, finances, everything was reconsidered in the brutal light of public scrutiny. And caught in that recalibration were the two people who had stood by him, not as accomplices, but as daughters. For Beatrice, loyalty to her father was never up for negotiation. Even when the palace distanced itself from Andrew, even when advisors pushed for silence, she remained steadfast. But that very loyalty became a mark against her. Within palace walls, where perception mattered more than truth, being Andrew's daughter meant guilt by proximity. Edward, always a pragmatist with a sharp eye for optics, reportedly saw this as a tipping point. He viewed Beatrice not as a victim of circumstance, but as a threat to royal rehabilitation. And so, whispers began, that it was time to draw the line, that her continued involvement in royal-adjacent work blurred the public's understanding of who was officially in or out of favour. Behind closed doors, Edward is said to have issued a quiet ultimatum. If the monarchy was to survive its latest round of crises, it needed to sever emotional ties from reputational damage, even if it meant sacrificing family. Private royal communications between key senior members and external partners, many now redacted from official record, allegedly contained subtle directives to deprioritize Beatrice's visibility. Events she was once routinely invited to were quietly restructured. Opportunities for collaboration with crown-backed charities mysteriously evaporated. It was never explicit. But it didn't have to be. The pattern was undeniable. One source close to the situation claimed Beatrice received a call weeks before the funding freeze, warning her to reconsider her public role and allow things to cool. The message was diplomatic but unmistakable. Step back or be pushed. She ignored it, believing, perhaps naively, that her work spoke for itself, that merit and impact could outweigh headlines and her last name. But when the media abruptly began downplaying her foundation's achievements, it became impossible to ignore the orchestrated nature of her fall. Press that had once celebrated her modern approach suddenly shifted tone. Articles praising her youth initiatives were pulled mid-publication. Media requests dried up. Her work was rendered invisible not because it had failed, but because the family needed distance, and Edward had ensured it. Beatrice wasn't punished for what she did, but for who she stood by. For refusing to disown the man the monarchy wished to erase, and in choosing principle over palace politics, she became collateral in a war she never started. A daughter's loyalty became a royal liability. While Edward may have believed he was preserving the monarchy's image, his actions sparked fury in someone who had quietly watched it all unfold. Princess Eugenie. When Beatrice was silenced, Eugenie roared. Furious and determined, she took to private channels, warning palace aides, allies, and even the press that this erasure will not go unnoticed. What started as a family conflict was now a full-blown rebellion from within, led by the princess no one expected to defy protocol. Eugenie, always the quieter of the two sisters, had never been one to stir the waters, but what they did to Beatrice shattered something in her. She had watched the woman who had protected her all her life be stripped of her work, her dignity, and her royal support, and she knew immediately that silence was no longer an option. In the days following the funding freeze, palace insiders noted an unusual flurry of communication from Eugenie's office. Discreet messages sent through encrypted platforms, calls to long-ignored contacts in the media, and firm, coded inquiries directed at royal departments known for keeping things buried. She was no longer asking questions, she was making demands. One particular confrontation sent a ripple through royal staff. Eugenie had arrived unannounced at a briefing where Edward's aide-de-camp was scheduled to meet with royal communications. She didn't wait for an invitation. She marched straight in and asked point-blank why her sister's name had been systematically erased from upcoming engagement calendars. Witnesses claim the room froze. The aide tried to deflect, but Eugenie wasn't there for pleasantries. But her defiance didn't end at words. An internal email from Beatrice's foundation mysteriously found its way to a third-party journalist, a leak that exposed Eugenie's direct involvement in coordinating response efforts. It wasn't sloppy, it was strategic. The email included timelines, names, even fundraising projections, proof that the foundation had been thriving before it was crippled. And though no one could trace the leak officially to Eugenie, palace investigators didn't need confirmation. The message had already reached the public. Behind the scenes, support for the sisters was growing, quiet, calculated support. Catherine, Princess of Wales, reportedly met with Eugenie at Kensington Palace under the guise of discussing children's education programs. But those close to the meeting say Catherine offered more than sympathy. She offered strategy. Together, they explored ways to bring the sisters back into public favour without directly confronting the crown. But it wasn't just Catherine. Whispers soon emerged of a clandestine meeting between Eugenie and Princess Anne. The two royals, bound by a shared history of being underestimated, spoke in hushed tones about diplomatic war, not with press releases, but with persistence. If the firm wanted Beatrice erased quietly, the women of the family would make it loud. Fueled by growing outrage, Beatrice and Eugenie drafted an internal letter to the Royal Advisory Board. It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration, a demand for clarity, for justice, for answers. The letter stopped short of accusing anyone by name, but it left no room for doubt this was personal, and it would not be forgiven. Yet, as the royal sisters launched their quiet resistance, Edward was preparing a public appearance that would not only justify his decision but ignite a new scandal. At a charity gala meant to project unity, Edward stunned royal watchers with a cryptic speech. "Legacy must align with duty," he said. To many, it was a direct strike against Beatrice. But behind the curtain, sources say Edward was cornered, forced to make the speech after a private call with the king, who feared the family was fracturing beyond repair. The gala was supposed to be routine, a polished, rehearsed display of royal solidarity meant to distract from the chaos erupting behind palace doors. But instead, it became a stage for something far more pointed. Edward stood at the podium with the calm of a seasoned royal, yet every word dripped with veiled intent. He didn't name names. He didn't need to. Legacy must align with duty, he intoned, locking eyes with select members of the audience. The room, lined with diplomatic figures and media elites, froze. The phrase landed like a coded verdict: duty, yes. But whose duty? And at what cost? Insiders later revealed that Edward had not planned to speak so directly. But the day before, he received a call from King Charles. The tone was not paternal, it was political. Charles, increasingly concerned by the growing public sympathy for Beatrice and the quiet rebellion bubbling within the family, demanded a show of strength. The monarchy needed to look cohesive, unbreakable, controlled. Edward, already under scrutiny for his role in the foundation scandal, was ordered to clarify the Crown's stance. What followed was less clarification and more condemnation. The event was tightly orchestrated, every camera angle, every handshake, every smile calculated to sell the illusion of royal unity. But no illusion could mask the storm brewing beneath. The public, ever watchful, sensed the tension. And rather than restoring faith, Edward's speech ignited further backlash. Commentators dissected his words with surgical precision, many concluding that the prince had publicly disowned his niece without the decency of direct confrontation. Sympathy for Beatrice surged. Social media lit up with support, painting her as a victim of institutional coldness. People weren't just angry, they were heartbroken. Palace aides tried to manage the fallout. Internally, a confidential report revealed a growing divide in public sentiment. Private polling showed a sharp shift in favor of next-generation royals, those like Beatrice, Eugenie, and even Catherine, who represented compassion and progress over rigidity and formality. The establishment was losing ground, and fast. And it wasn't just the public who noticed. Camilla, watching closely from her vantage point, reportedly gave Edward her full support after the speech. Some say she applauded the discipline it took to put family feelings aside. Her quiet nod to Edward's hardline stance was seen by a few as a strategic move, one that further alienated the young royals and tightened the grip of the old guard. Whatever her intention, it signaled a dangerous shift. The palace was choosing preservation over people. But the more Edward tried to control the narrative, the more it slipped from his grasp until one of Beatrice's personal letters was mysteriously leaked. It was never meant to be public. In a handwritten letter addressed to a confidant, Princess Beatrice poured out the truth, grief, betrayal, and disbelief. When that letter was leaked, the world saw not a royal, but a woman crushed by the very institution she was born to serve. The letter was raw, unfiltered. Ink-stained emotion scrawled across pages never intended for public eyes. It was found tucked within a bundle of correspondence believed to be archived for private review, yet somehow, it made its way into the hands of someone with no intention of keeping it secret. The words ignited like fire across headlines. "I did everything right," Beatrice had written. "So why did they erase me?" In those 12 words, centuries of royal silence cracked open. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't polished. It was pain, pure and undiluted. And it struck something deeper than any official statement ever could. She spoke of the silence, of reaching out to uncles who never replied, of watching her name vanish from event briefings, of the whispered warnings from staff members too afraid to speak aloud. But it wasn't just the betrayal that broke her. It was the realization that her worth had been measured not by her work, not by her loyalty, but by the shadow cast by her father. She begged the question the public had already begun asking. If the monarchy claims to stand for duty, what duty justifies turning on your own? The fallout was instant. Charity partners and youth advocacy groups that had worked alongside her rushed to her defense. Open letters were published. Social campaigns erupted with support. Schools where she had spoken out on mental health held assemblies addressing what they called injustice, cloaked in tradition. What was once a quiet culling within the palace had now become a public reckoning. And yet, what unsettled people most wasn't just the content of the letter, it was how it got out. A palace aide, speaking under strict anonymity, claimed the leak wasn't accidental. That it had come from inside, from someone who wanted the truth exposed, no matter the cost. This revelation changed the tone completely. It wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a warning. If even Beatrice, with her unshakable composure and polished reputation, could be erased so easily, who was next? In the days that followed, Beatrice withdrew completely from royal duties. No statements, no public sightings. A silence that, this time, spoke volumes. She was no longer just the daughter of a disgraced prince. She was now a symbol of what happens when the crown protects its name more fiercely than its own blood. And with her absence came a vacuum the monarchy struggled to fill. The world wasn't asking where Beatrice went, they were asking why she had to leave in the first place. The letter reopened old wounds and exposed new ones. But more importantly, it reignited scrutiny on the very man who had signed the directive to dismantle her work. Edward's leadership, once viewed as composed and measured, was now under siege, not by tabloids, but by the court of public conscience. And this time, no speech could reverse the tide. With emotions raw and reputations bruised, a long-buried document surfaced, one that called into question the entire justification behind Edward's actions. Months before the funding was cut, an internal audit had cleared Beatrice's foundation with flying colours. Buried in royal archives, this report proves there was no financial misconduct, no breach of royal protocol. So if everything was clean, why the freeze? And why the lies? The document in question was dated 6 weeks prior to Edward's now infamous signature, the one that stopped the lifeblood of Beatrice's charity without warning or public justification. This confidential audit, conducted by a trusted firm with long-standing ties to the crown, painted a glowing picture of Beatrice's foundation. It confirmed high standards of governance, effective resource allocation, and community impact that exceeded expectations. In short, the report declared the foundation not only compliant, but exemplary. And yet, it was hidden, not delayed, not questioned, buried. Its sudden emergence was not part of a scheduled release, but the result of a quiet whistleblower, a royal accountant whose conscience had begun to fracture under the weight of secrecy. He described, under anonymity, how after submitting the audit, he had been told it would be filed under internal use only. When he questioned why, he was told simply, "Priorities have changed." That phrase haunted him for weeks, and when he learned of the funding cut, he knew exactly what it meant. The palace had lied, not just to Beatrice, but to everyone watching. The document was never meant to be seen by the public. It was kept sealed in a restricted vault, its contents shielded from press inquiries and freedom of information requests. But once exposed, it tore through the palace's narrative like wildfire. Overnight, Edward's justification collapsed. The idea that Beatrice's foundation had been underperforming or misaligned with royal values no longer held weight. In fact, it did the opposite, proving that Beatrice had delivered on every promise while being punished for reasons that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with politics. Sources inside Clarence's house revealed that King Charles was reportedly blindsided by the audit's contents. He had been told, in Edward's words, that the foundation was too unstable to support. When the king saw the real report, witnesses claim he went quiet, then furious. He had relied on his brother's assessment, but what he received was not an honest evaluation. It was a misdirection, a cover, and now, with the monarchy's credibility hanging in the balance, the betrayal cut even deeper. But perhaps the most explosive fallout came from within. Princess Anne, long considered the monarchy's moral compass, allegedly confronted Edward in a private meeting. Sources say her words were sharp and precise. "You've made a decision in darkness and dragged the rest of us into the consequences." The confrontation wasn't theatrical, but it was seismic. For Anne to question Edward so openly marked a shift the public rarely sees, royal bloodlines colliding under the weight of concealed truths. With the report now public, calls erupted for a formal inquiry into royal financial transparency. Parliament members whispered about intervention. Media outlets demanded answers. Even former royal staff began offering to testify. What had started as a family dispute had now spiraled into a constitutional crisis. The veil of untouchability was thinning, and in the center of the storm stood Beatrice, not as a victim anymore, but as the undeniable proof of what happens when silence is forced and justice is delayed. And as the truth begins to unravel, a final confrontation looms between Edward and the woman he thought would never fight back. She was cast aside, silenced, and shamed. With a new platform, fresh alliances, and public support surging behind her, she issues a quiet but thunderous statement. "This family will not erase my legacy. Not again." What she does next sends tremors through the monarchy and leaves Edward facing consequences he never saw coming. Beatrice did not return with noise. She returned with power. Quietly, confidently, she announced the relaunch of her foundation this time without a single thread of royal funding. Backed by independent philanthropic networks and private global benefactors, she restructured her entire initiative under a new name, free from the crown's influence. It was a bold move, a clear message. She no longer needed royal permission to do the work she was born to do. For the first time in her life, her mission would stand alone, without interference, without compromise. The announcement shocked royal reporters. Weeks earlier, speculation was rampant that Beatrice would retreat permanently from public life, crushed by scandal and betrayal. Instead, she stepped back onto the stage, not as a dependent royal, but as a leader in her own right. Her return dominated headlines, but more than that, it dominated hearts. The same youth organizations that once feared losing her support came flooding back. Community leaders, educators, and mental health advocates praised her for turning humiliation into purpose. In a single stroke, she reclaimed the narrative Edward tried so hard to suppress, and she didn't stop there. In a public address streamed online, Beatrice made her position unmistakably clear. "This isn't about money," she said. "This is about voice, about presence, about the people behind the titles who've been quietly fighting to matter." It was a statement not just of independence, but of resistance, a refusal to be erased, a refusal to let others define her worth. And it resonated far beyond the palace gates. Beatrice had become more than a princess. She had become a symbol for everyone pushed to the margins by tradition and silence. Behind the scenes, the shockwave was felt. Whispers emerged from palace staff, suggesting King Charles had reached out privately to Beatrice in what some described as a quiet apology. Not formal, not documented, but heartfelt, whether out of guilt, regret, or acknowledgement of error, no one can say for certain. But what was once irreparable now seemed slightly open to healing. The king may not have stopped the exile, but he couldn't deny her return. For Edward, however, there was no such redemption. His reputation took a hit that no speech could undo. Polling inside the palace showed a significant dip in his public favorability, particularly among younger generations. His image, once seen as stable and loyal, now carried the weight of perceived betrayal. And within the royal circle, a silent shift began, one where his authority no longer went unquestioned. As for Beatrice, she closed her address with the words that had been building inside her since the first day she was shut out. "This isn't just about me, it's about all of us," they tried to silence. In that moment, the monarchy felt the full force of what it means to underestimate a woman born into a system, but never fully owned by it. And as the royal family scrambles to recover from this emotional earthquake, one question still lingers in the air. Who's next? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.